Pluralism and corporatism. Pluralism and corporatism are two contrasting theories or approaches regarding the organization and representation of interests within a society or a political system. They offer different perspectives on how power and decision-making are distributed among various groups and entities. Pluralism. Interest group pluralism is a concept that underpins the functioning of democratic societies, emphasizing the diversity of interests and the role of various organized groups in influencing public policy. Pluralism posits that power and influence are dispersed among multiple, competing interest groups, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a single elite or ruling class. In the context of interest groups, pluralism encompasses several key elements. 1. Diverse representation. Pluralism acknowledges the existence of a multitude of interest groups, each representing different segments of society with distinct concerns, preferences, and objectives. These groups can range from business associations, labor unions, and professional organizations to advocacy groups, environmental organizations, and civil rights movements. The diversity of representation ensures that a wide array of societal interests are brought to the attention of policymakers. 2. Competition and negotiation. Pluralism recognizes that interest groups compete with one another for influence and resources within the political arena. Competition among groups serves as a mechanism through which different viewpoints are aired, debated, and ultimately reconciled through negotiation and compromise, rather than one dominant group dictating policy outcomes. Pluralistic systems prioritize the negotiation of conflicting interests to reach consensus-based decisions. 3. Access to policymakers. A core tenet of pluralism is the idea that interest groups have access to policymakers and decision-making processes, while some groups may have greater resources or privileged access than others. Pluralism emphasizes the principle of equal opportunity for all groups to participate in the political process and advocate for their interests. Access to policymakers allows interest groups to present their perspectives, provide expertise, and influence policy outcomes. 4. Democratic engagement. Interest group pluralism is closely associated with democratic governance, as it enables citizens to participate in the political process beyond voting in elections. By organizing into interest groups, individuals can collectively voice their concerns, preferences, and grievances, thereby contributing to the formulation and implementation of public policies. Pluralism fosters citizen engagement by providing avenues for political expression, activism, and advocacy. 5. Policy outcomes. Pluralistic systems are characterized by the negotiation and compromise of competing interests, leading to policy outcomes that reflect a balance of viewpoints and priorities. rather than being dictated by a single dominant group or ideology. Public policies emerge through the interaction and accommodation of diverse interests. Pluralism aims to produce policies that are inclusive, responsive, and reflective of the broader societal context. 6. Critic and challenges despite its democratic ideal. Interest group pluralism has faced criticism and challenges. Critics argue that certain interest groups may wield disproportionate influence due to factors such as financial resources, organizational capacity, or interconnection. Moreover, pluralism may not adequately represent marginalized or underrepresented groups whose voices are marginalized within the political process. In conclusion, interest group pluralism is a foundational concept in democratic theory, highlighting the importance of diverse representation, competition, and negotiation among organized groups in influencing public policy. While pluralism promotes citizen engagement, inclusivity, and responsiveness in governance, it also requires vigilance to ensure that power and influence are distributed equitably among all groups, thereby upholding the principles of democratic participation and representation. Deep corporatism. Corporatism in the context of interest groups refers to a system where societal interests are organized into a hierarchical structure dominated by a limited number of large organizations or corporations. Unlike pluralism, which emphasizes the diversity and competition of interest groups, corporatism prioritizes the collaboration and coordination of select organizations with significant influence over policymaking processes. Here's an exploration of corporatism within interest groups. 1. Hierarchical structure. Corporatist systems feature a hierarchical organizational structure where a small number of dominant organizations or corporations exert significant influence at the top. These central bodies are typically representative of specific sectors of society, such as labor, business, agriculture, or professional groups. Unlike pluralistic systems where power is dispersed among various competing groups, corporatism concentrates power within a limited number of centralized organizations. 2. Exclusive representation. In contrast to pluralism, which allows for the participation of numerous interest groups, corporatism tends to grant exclusive representation to sanctioned organizations within each sector. These authorized bodies are empowered to speak on behalf of their respective constituencies, effectively limiting the diversity of voices and perspectives in the decision-making process. By granting exclusive representation, corporatist systems prioritize the interests of established organizations over grassroots movements or smaller interest groups. 3. Collaboration with government. Corporatist interest groups often collaborate closely with government authorities in formulating policies and making decisions. This collaboration may take various forms, including advisory roles, participation in policymaking forums, or direct involvement in the implementation of government programs. Corporatist organizations are seen as key stakeholders in the governance process, with their input and recommendations carrying significant weight in policy deliberations. 4. Policy consensus. Corporatist systems aim to achieve policy consensus through negotiated agreements among the dominant interest groups, rather than relying on competition and compromise among a wide range of interest groups. Corporatism emphasizes collective bargaining and cooperation among the select few organizations representing major societal sectors. Policy decisions are often reached through consensus building processes that involve representatives from both the government and corporatist organizations. 5. Stability and control. Proponents of corporatism argue that it promotes stability and efficiency in governance by streamlining decision-making processes and minimizing conflicts among interest groups. By centralizing power and authority within a limited number of organizations, corporatist systems seek to ensure order and coherence in policymaking. However, critics contend that corporatism may stifle dissent, limit political pluralism, and exacerbate inequalities by favoring established elites over marginalized groups. 6. Challenges to pluralism. Corporatism poses challenges to the principles of pluralism, which emphasize the importance of diversity, competition, and inclusivity in interest representation. By privileging certain organizations over others and restricting access to decision-making processes, corporatism may undermine the democratic ideal of equal participation and representation. Critics argue that corporatist systems risk entrenching vested interests and perpetuating inequalities, thereby limiting the responsiveness and accountability of governance institutions. 7. Historical and cultural contexts. The prevalence of corporatism in interest group dynamics can vary, depending on historical, cultural, and institutional factors within a given society. Some countries may exhibit strong corporatist tendencies, characterized by close collaboration between government and powerful interest groups, while others may adhere more closely to pluralistic principles of interest representation. The extent of corporatism within interest groups is influenced by factors such as the strength of labor unions, the concentration of economic power, and the nature of political institutions. In summary, corporatism in interest groups represents a departure from the pluralistic model of governance, emphasizing hierarchical structures, exclusive representation, and collaboration with government authorities. While corporatism may offer certain benefits such as stability and efficiency, it also raises concerns about the concentration of power, the exclusion of diverse voices, and the erosion of democratic principles. The balance between corporatist and pluralistic dynamics in interest group politics reflects broader tensions between centralization and decentralization, hierarchy and diversity within democratic societies.
Interest group is an organization of individuals who share a common political goal, seek to influence public policy decisions, and unite for that specific purpose. An interest group must have all three of these parts. One by itself is not going to make it an interest group. So a group has to come together and have a specific political goal, but if they don't come together to influence public policy decisions, like how members of Congress vote or how they debate on a certain topic, then they wouldn't necessarily be an interest group. Likewise, they have to come together and unite for the specific purpose of influencing public policy. Who are interest groups? There are many examples of interest groups. Some of them have names, some of them don't. Some of them you've heard before just referred to as kind of nebulous terms, the religious right, big business, or big pharma. Others, you actually can put names on organizations, and these organizations have specific parts of them which act as interest groups coming together in order to promote certain public policy goals. You can think of the AARP or the NAACP, or even the Sierra Club. Oftentimes you'll hear about interest groups when you're listening to political ads or listening to different particular policy statements put out by groups, and they will say, for example, this is backed by the nurses union or the National Union of Teachers or certain environmentalist groups or certain institutes, etc. Interest groups have symbiotic relationships. What that means is that they give something and then they get something in return of equal or greater value. People join the interest groups, so that's the group of the people with the arrow to the interest groups. The interest groups then go and influence the government. And in return, the government gives things to the interest groups that the interest groups want, which of course are made up of their particular individuals who contribute to them. So this symbiotic relationship actually generates this relations between these individual groups. And it's very important, the relationship which the interest groups have both with their members and with the government, because if any of this cycle is broken, then the interest group is ineffective. And the best interest groups, the ones which are most effective when it comes to influencing public policy, are the ones that have these unbroken cycles and are not only good at one side of the equation, but are good at the other side as well. So what are the roles of interest groups? There are 6 different broad categories of what interest groups do. Number 1 is representation. This sounds kind of like what, elected representatives do in terms of representing their constituents. Representation by interest groups is when they represent members to Congress, persuade policymakers to hear concerns of the members, etc. So in other words, just like your congressperson, it represents you, you can be part of an interest group, say, the American Cancer Society, and the American Cancer Society can go in and say that, well, we are representing people who have this specific interest. Or the Save the Whales Association. This is, we are going to talk to the members of Congress and try to get them to understand that our members of our particular interest group have this interest, and we want you to hear out their concerns. Number 2 is participation. Interest groups provide a unique avenue for regular people who vote, voters to come in and actually give their input to what's going on with their elected officials outside of elections. We already talked about how you can hold different elected officials accountable by choosing not to elect them in a future election, But what do you do in the meantime when you already have them in office? Well, interest groups provide one way to participate. You can pool your resources and channel efforts for collective action through interest groups. And oftentimes, the interest groups have the time, they have the money, and they have the ability to bring your concerns to the forefront with your participation. Number three is education. Interest groups are actually great at educating policymakers about issues. The Save the Whales Foundation, for example, would know much more about whales and saving them than probably any member of Congress. And so if a bill comes up where there's going to be issues about saving whales, then the Save the Whales Association can go in and educate the different members as to what their vote would mean, whether a vote for the bill would be a good thing or whether it would be a bad thing and why. Number four is agenda building. Interest groups use agenda building to get issues on the political agenda and make them a high priority for action. Just like we were talking about political parties, how they kind of build the political agenda, this is one of those things where they can go in and say, we know that there's a bill that's coming up, member of Congress, and we want you to take this very seriously and really act on this one quickly because this is very important to our members. And of course, the more that they hear this, the more likely that the member will be to actually consider moving forward on something if they believe that there is a large constituency behind that issue who wants something done in a certain way. Number five is provision of program alternatives. They can give proposals for how an issue should be dealt with after it's put on the agenda. So perhaps they weren't the one who put something on the agenda. They didn't say, hey, you don't have a bill on Save the Whales, but you should. But instead, there's another bill that comes up about Save the Pandas, and Save the Whales has an idea of how that issue should be dealt with. It's already on the agenda. It's something that's being talked about by the policymakers. So what do they want to have happen with this? And this is another form of influence they can use, telling the member how they want them to vote, how they want them to react to a particular issue that is already there. And number six is program monitoring. And that is keeping tabs on the consequences and the effects of the law. So laws, you begin the process when we're talking about how a bill becomes a law, and you begin the process of putting these things into action, then finally you get this bill, you get this law put into place. Hooray, it's all done. But is anybody checking to see if that law actually did anything good? Or if it's failing, or if it didn't actually address or create a solution to the problem that was there in the first place? Well, actually, there are interest groups who pay attention to such things. They keep tabs on the consequences, the effects of the laws. They oftentimes have a lot of research and analysis, which goes into that. And then they can bring that back to, again, providing program alternatives, providing different amendments to different laws, and using their particular abilities to influence how they're going to how the members are going to create or react to that certain problem, or adapt something which they did before which didn't necessarily go well. Of course, how do they do this? We'll talk about this in a minute. It's not only talking, it's not only information. Of course, it's a lot of money. How do you get someone's ear that is running for election or that is in a elected position? Well, of course, they're going to need the money to run again, or they're going to need the money in order to keep their constituency happy. And so oftentimes being able to pool all of those resources together, as we saw with participation, is really a key thing, because if you can get all of that money together and say, hey, we're from Save the Whales. We're not sure how much you've thought about the whales lately, but we may be able to kick some money your way, or be able to build part of your campaign, or help you out, or put in a good word for you campaigning with our folks in our jurisdiction, if you can show them just how much you care about the fact that they care about the whales, or so to speak. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer because I'm not a lobbyist, because I'm not getting that particular message across in a very effective way, but that's generally the idea, is how do we get the interest group uses all of these different tactics in order to influence the way that government works through its members. Number five, how are interest groups different? Well, they differ by their shared common goal, of course. So they have different issues and different ideologies. The National Rifle Association, of course, cares about rifles and cares about gun control and gun safety and things like that. Whereas maybe the NAACP doesn't care as much about guns, but cares about some other particular issue. But there are also different types of interest groups. Three types of interest groups that I want to talk about. Economic interest groups particularly deal with money issues. So your interest group is specifically around something that has to do with finances or cash, lowering the taxes, raising the wages for low-income workers, some sort of farm subsidy, for example, for farmers in California who are growing vegetables, favorable regulations for trade, that type of stuff. Second type of group would be equal opportunity interest groups. And these interest groups are less interested in money issues and more interested in civil rights issues. So they're going to bring issues of unrepresented groups or economic rights to the foreground of the members' attentions. And then we have public interest groups. They focus on non-economic issues. So collective goods, we're talking about general things that everybody benefits from, so to speak. So clean air and clean water, peace across the land, human rights internationally. They also deal with some things that maybe not everybody benefits from or not everybody agrees about, but they're also kind of have a different kind of collective personality to them. So, for example, abortion rights, marijuana rights, marriage rights, those types of things. Included in the public interest group section are government interest groups. Government interest groups have two flavors: foreign government interest groups and domestic government interest groups, having to deal with either foreign policy or domestic policy. Of course, the foreign policy interest groups are going to, for example, affect the way that we deal with trade policy with another country. How do we want to have a stance against, say, a country that we are concerned has nuclear weapons? Domestic policy really has to do with federal policy here at home and how we want to work with how the different federal policies within, public policy realms within the within the federal sphere. So what do interest groups have to give? Well, first off, it's important to know that they give things to different people. We talked about some of the ways that you can, things that they do before a couple slides back. So let's talk about what they have to give. I mentioned a couple of these before, money being the very big number one, because although money doesn't necessarily buy everything, if you're an interest group that has no money, it's pretty much guaranteed that you will get nothing done. Money provides a lot of things. It's not only for specifically donating to candidates, but they can pay for well-trained staff. They can pay for professional assistants. They can pay for managers who are sitting there running the thing. They can pay for research and development. They can pay for a whole lot of paraphernalia and advertising and brochures and pamphlets and all of that good stuff. Important to know when you're dealing with money is our political action committees. These are called PACs. You may have heard of them, or super PACs. PACs are just the fundraising arms of interest groups. So they're the ones who deal with all of the money part of the interest group. So important to know when you're saying, okay, well, wait a second. So these interest groups now are raising money and using money to influence people. Is that something that's okay? Well, the Supreme Court has decided that it is. The Supreme Court has ruled that money is actually a form of free speech and that corporations can actually be individuals for the purpose of using money as free speech. However, there are limits that can be given. The Supreme Court has said there's a $5,000 limit on donations to candidates. So even if you have a political action committee coming together on behalf of an interest group, they can only give $5,000 to the candidate directly. So say we want to elect Susan Smith, we can only give Susan Smith $5,000 from the Save the Whales PAC. Now, of course, that doesn't completely limit what Save the Whales can do for Susan Smith, particularly since a Supreme Court decision which came down in 2010 called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, often referred to simply as Citizens United. What this case did is it removed limits on political expenditures. Now, political expenditures are different from political donations or contributions to a candidate. Contributions to a candidate, you just throw money directly at the candidate and they can spend it any way they want to help get themselves elected. Political expenditures, on the other hand, are you're spending money more kind of on their behalf. If you happen to spend your money on something and it happens to benefit a particular candidate, well, that can't be said that you were giving money directly to them. And so with that decision, the Citizens United decision, we really have a huge loophole in which PACs can kind of go around this campaign finance issue of the $5,000 limit and go on with political expenditures which don't have a limit on them right now. And so they can do a whole lot of issue advocacy. They can do a whole lot of really putting out there what their ideas are on particular people, of particular topics, without having that particular regulation. And this is one of the reasons that interest groups really dominate in the political sphere, and that's because they have these sufficient resources. Just you or I, and our personal fortunes or lack thereof, might not have the ability to have a trained staff and a full office running of people whose job it is to make sure that what we want done in the world gets to the ears of our legislators. But we don't have the ability to do that because we don't have the resources. Well, interest groups do, and that's what they do and why they exist. And so one thing that they can definitely give to the government officials is money and those resources. Second thing is leadership. They can organize even without other resources. Of course, the big PACs and the big interest groups that we're dealing with normally now are all about the money, but there have been issues in the past where it really was all about the leadership. If you can remember Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, really that didn't have to do a whole lot with money. It had to do with organization. It had to deal with a strong and charismatic leader coming forward, presenting an agenda, and using that agenda to influence the way that public policy ran in this country. Another thing that they can contribute is membership, just straight up size, and also straight up intensity of the people who subscribe to them. For example, the AARP, Association of Retired Persons, has 35 million members and growing every day. And those people, when you have the AARP, who represents 35 million people, remember that representation piece, knocking at a person's door, an elected member's door, saying, hey, we'd like to talk to you. We 35 million people would like to speak with you about something we find that's important, then oftentimes you're going to have their ear. Also, you can look at membership intensity. When you get a political action committee, and an interest group, which is around a very specific topic, then they're generally known to be the ones to go to for that specific topic, particularly for education. Also, you have interest groups which, because they are dedicated and focused to one particular topic, they can be pretty intense. And so those are the ones, for example, this is where I have the NRA listed on gun control matters. When the NRA has their members riled up about gun control, Congress and members of Congress are going to listen about it because they know that that membership has that intensity around that particular issue. Interest groups also have information to give. They collect studies, conduct studies, they collect data on the impact of the law and the regulations. They're really the ones doing all of the homework. If you think about what an elected official does with their day, they really don't have a whole lot of time to go and read in-depth studies on how to save the whales, nor do they have time to compare different studies across different states or whatever have you about how a particular problem could be solved. But what they do have are different interest groups who have the time and the money to do that, and who can provide them with some sort of concise information which they can use to help make their decision. Interest groups also give things back to their members. Like I said, we have a symbiotic relationship going on. Three specific things, or three categories we can divide that into. Number one is material benefits. They give the members information. This is what's going on with your elected officials. This is where they are on a particular bill. This is where we're moving, and this is where movement needs to take place. Number two are solidarity benefits. The benefit of being able to interact and bond with other people who think like you and have similar goals and want to